Chapter 10, The Mexicans. Some of the oldest and the newest Americans are from Mexico. The area that is now the southwestern United States had settlements of people from Mexico long before the Americans arrived. Most Mexican Americans, however, arrived in the United States in the 20th century, and especially during and after World War II. There is no single name that adequately covers the various people of Mexican ancestry living in the United States. 1. Descendants of the original Mexican settlers in the Southwest before it was part of the United States. 2. Illegal aliens from Mexico. 3. Emigrants from Mexico who are here legally but are not citizens. 4. Transients from Mexico staying in the United States for varying periods of time, from days to decades, on various kinds of official documents, visas, work permits, etc. 5. Naturalized American citizens from Mexico. And 6. American-born citizens descended from either legal or illegal immigrants or from transients. The U.S. Census estimates that there are about 5 million Mexican Americans, one of the largest ethnic groups in the United States, but one of the least publicized. An additional 2 million illegal aliens from Mexico are estimated to be living in the United States. Together with a census undercount of persons of Mexican ancestry, as well as other low-income individuals, this means that the true number of Mexican origin people in the United States may be closer to 8 million. The great majority of Mexican Americans live in 5 southwestern states, which have a combined Mexican American population of more than 4 million people. About half of these live in California, where they substantially outnumber the black population and constitute about 1/6 of the people in that state. The culture of Mexican Americans goes back not only to Mexico, but also to Spain, and thus to Western civilization in general. Yet their contemporary values and ways of life set them apart from other Americans. Racially, they are both Spanish and Indian in ancestry, to various degrees in a multicolored population. The millions of people lumped together as Mexicans, Mexican Americans, or Chicanos represent a variety of historical experiences, many foreign-born, more native-born, and a handful of families that were here long before there was a United States. Their only common denominator is that, at some time or another, they originated in Mexico. Mexico. The Aztec civilization developed and spread through Central America before the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere. This warlike people conquered and ruled many other Indian tribes, including those in the region that would later become Mexico. Prisoners of war provided human sacrifices to the Aztec gods, the prisoners' hearts being torn out of their bodies in front of elaborate temples, and their skulls later being stored on racks alongside. In other rituals, maidens were beheaded as they danced. Aztec civilization lacked iron, coins, or the use of wheels for transportation or industrial purposes, such as gears. Their farming was primitive, lacking the use of plows. However, the Aztecs had writing, architecture, sculpture, and elaborate legal, social, political, and religious systems. In 1519, Cortes arrived in Mexico and was welcomed by the Emperor Montezuma. Believing Cortes and his men to be gods, whose arrival was prophesied in the Aztec religious doctrine, Montezuma showered them with gifts, including gold. Once the Spaniards realized that the Aztecs had gold, they determined to conquer them. The Spanish forces were joined by Indian tribes subjugated under the Aztecs. Another potent ally consisted of European diseases, notably smallpox, measles, and influenza, which the Aztecs had never known and to which they had little or no biological resistance. By 1607, European diseases had annihilated from 90 to 95% of the Indian population. In Mexico, as in Latin America generally, the Spanish conquerors were expeditions of men, not whole communities of men, women, and children, as in the British colonies in North America. Sexual liaisons, sometimes including marriage, with native women therefore produced mixed Spanish and Indian offspring soon after the Spaniards arrived. By 1800, the mixed offspring, or mestizos, clearly outnumbered the Spaniards born in Spain, or the even smaller number of Negroes imported as slaves. Ultimately, mestizos came to outnumber the Indian population as well. Today, only a small percentage of Mexicans are either pure Caucasian or pure Indian. An elaborate ranking of various racial mixtures existed in Mexico, as elsewhere in Latin America. Similar elaborate gradations of color still exist in modern Mexican American communities. Both Latins and Anglo-Saxons equate whiteness with superiority, but the Latin emphasis on color gradation differs from the Anglo-Saxon emphasis on race as such, the stark dichotomy of black and white. From Mexico, explorers, adventurers, and religious missionaries spread northward into what is now the southwestern United States. By the late 18th century, Spain had small, isolated settlements scattered throughout California, New Mexico, and Texas. These included Laredo, San Antonio, El Paso, Santa Fe, Tucson, San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Jose. These were typically small enclaves of civilian, military, and religious authorities who attempted to conquer local Indians and bring them into the Spanish culture and religion at the bottom. Where this effort succeeded, the Indians were brought to live and work in the missions, in a state of tutelage and semi-bondage. After the monarchy fell in Spain as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, Mexico struggled toward independence, which was proclaimed in 1821. Among the policies of the new Mexican government was one permitting the establishment of an American community on Mexican territories. At first, the American immigrants adapted to the Mexican culture, learned the Spanish language, and some married Mexican women. But as the number of Americans rose rapidly during the 1820s, they retained their separate American communities, language, and customs. Increasingly hostile relations between the Americans and the Mexicans eventually led to the War for Texas independence. The United States sent troops in to aid the Americans, and in 1845, Texas was annexed as part of the United States. In 1847, American troops captured Mexico City, forced the resignation of the Mexican leader, General Santa Anna, and the following year signed a treaty with a new government, which transferred vast areas, 1/3 of Mexico, to the United States. From the territory acquired from Mexico were created the states of California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Texas, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. Before the war, Mexico had been larger than the United States. The continuing influence of the Hispanic heritage on the southwestern states can be seen in the names of places. All the large cities of California have Spanish names, in the architectural styles of the region, as well as in the ranching patterns established by Mexicans and followed by Americans. The Mexicans who remained in the new states became a minority, different in language, customs, and race from the growing American population in these areas. Substantial differences between American and Spanish property laws caused many of the Spanish or Mexican settlers to lose their lands, aided by fraud, corrupt officials, and violence. A few Mexican Americans struck back in armed outlaw bands. Most, however, found themselves powerless on the fringes of the new society. There were regional variations in the position of the small Spanish or Mexican populations left in the southwestern United States. In Texas, where the non-Hispanic population was the overwhelming majority at the time of annexation, the upper-class white Hispanic elite was accepted into the dominant American elite, but the multicolored masses of the Mexicans were rigidly excluded from social or political participation and were confined to the lowest economic positions. In California, a separate group of wealthy Hispanics, called Californios, remained socially, economically, and politically influential until the late 19th century. Other states tended to be somewhere in between. By and large, the indigenous Hispanic people and culture remained in a subordinate role throughout the Southwest. Few, however, returned to Mexico. In Mexico itself, there was a highly rigid social class system, about 1% upper class, 2% middle class, and 97% lower class. In the urban areas, there was a larger middle class, but still about 3/4 of the people were in the lower class. Virtually all the emigrants from Mexico were to come from the lower class. In 19th century Mexico, debt peonage was so widespread as to be almost universal, among the rural masses. Landowners as creditors held the peons in virtual bondage for debts that were rarely paid off and that were inherited from generation to generation, like slavery. Illiteracy was widespread among the peons, who lived in extreme poverty and in social and political subjugation. As late as 1910, about 5% of Mexican families owned 90% of the land. Under the regime of General Porfirio Diaz, 1876 to 1910, changing land laws turned the communal land of many peasant villages into private lands owned by speculators, throwing many peasants into peonage or into the stream of migrant labor. Advances in public health led to a great population increase, from about 9 million in 1876 to about 15 million in 1910. About 80% of the population in Mexico lived in rural areas. Little of this growing and poverty-stricken population found its way to the United States in the 19th century. Some came to California during the mid-century gold rush, others to Arizona during the mining boom of the 1860s and the railroad construction period of the 1880s. Some also became migratory farm workers in Texas. But by and large, relatively few Mexicans crossed the economic, social, and geographic barriers separating the two countries. For many Mexicans, getting free of debt peonage was no easy matter, and the great Southwest desert was a formidable barrier in the era before modern cheap transportation. The construction of railroads in both the United States and Mexico opened the way for masses of poor Mexican villagers to find their way into the rapidly developing southwestern United States. American employers began actively recruiting workers in Mexico, directly or through Mexican contract labor agents. In addition to the economic attraction of the American Southwest, Mexicans were moved by events in Mexico itself. The Mexican Revolution of 1909 set off more than a decade of internal political and military struggles, in which more than 1 million were killed. Many fled to the United States, more as refugees than as immigrants. The combinations of pushes and pulls brought almost 10% of the total population of Mexico to the American Southwest after the turn of the century. The Mexican populations of Texas and New Mexico nearly doubled between 1900 and 1910. The Mexican population of Arizona more than doubled, and that of California quadrupled. The Mexican population of these four states went from about 100,000 in 1900 to 200,000 in 1910. It doubled again in the next decade and tripled in the decade after that. This was the first of three great waves of emigration from Mexico. Mexican immigration. The history of emigration from Mexico is that of three great waves of people moving into the United States, with two massive deportation periods separating them. The seeking and then expelling of Mexicans reflects counteracting tendencies among Americans in the Southwest. Employers of agricultural and other low-paid labor have pressed for a national policy of more open access to the United States from Mexico, while groups concerned with crime, welfare dependency, or other social problems among Mexican immigrants have pressed for more restrictive policies. Shifts in political strength among the contending groups of Americans are reflected in the changing immigration policies and changing levels of enforcement. In more recent years, the growing political influence of Mexican Americans has also become a factor in American immigration policy. The first wave of immigrants. The railroads that enabled masses of Mexicans to reach the United States also employed many of them after their arrival. Most Mexican immigrants in the early 20th century worked for the railroad at some time or other, as construction workers, as watchmen, or as laborers maintaining the tracks. Many lived in boxcars or in shacks near the railroads, primitive settlements that were the beginnings of many Mexican-American communities today. Agriculture and mining employed most of the other Mexican Americans in the pre-World War I era. These three dominant occupations all tended to isolate Mexican Americans in enclaves separate from the rest of the American population. Their children grew up in a separate Spanish-speaking Mexican-American world. In agriculture, the children worked in the fields alongside their parents, often moving from place to place as the seasonal needs of different crops led the migratory labor gangs from one region to another. Education was either sporadic or non-existent under such conditions. The separation of Mexicans from the larger society also contributed to their being an invisible minority, as far as most Americans were concerned. Throughout the Southwest, Mexican workers provided much of the stoop labor that did the hard work in the fields, working 12 to 14 hours a day. Mexican-American agricultural workers did a wide variety of jobs, from growing cotton throughout the region to helping make California in this era become a major source of fruits and vegetables for the entire nation. The stereotypes of Mexicans as agricultural field hands were established in this era and would persist for decades, long after most eventually became urbanized. Before 1930, however, more than half of all Mexicans in the United States lived in rural areas. By and large, Mexicans in the United States settled close to the borders of Mexico during the early decades, although some seasonal migratory labor went north into the Rocky Mountain states or went deeper into California. During the 1930s, about 10% of the Mexican Americans found their way into factories and provided the nucleus of later Mexican-American urban communities. Agricultural laborers in this southwestern border region of the United States made double or triple the pay they made in Mexico in 1900, and the pay difference grew even wider over the next 3 decades. By 1930, the pay of agricultural laborers in the southwestern United States was about 6 times what it was in Mexico. Moreover, the pay in the interior region of the United States was higher still, for the heavy supply of Mexican labor kept the pay from rising as much in the border regions as in the rest of the United States. In railroads, mines, and factory occupations, the pay difference between the United States and Mexico was also very large. Mexicans working on American farms or in American factories were poor by American standards, but were prosperous by Mexican standards. They returned home to Mexico able to afford farm animals, farm implements, radios, and some even automobiles. Attempts to control the flow of people across the border in the face of such disparities in pay between the United States and Mexico proved largely futile. American immigration policies and institutions were set up essentially to screen a population crossing the ocean from Europe and landing at a few large ports. Stopping people who could literally walk across a 2,000-mile border at any point and disappear into existing American communities in the desert Southwest was a far more difficult task. Great numbers of Mexicans who were unable to meet literacy requirements and other immigration standards simply entered the United States illegally. Often they were aided and abetted by American employers and by labor contractors. The massive movement of people from Mexico to the United States was not a permanent emigration. Many came to stay for a season or for a few years to accumulate money and return to Mexico with better prospects than they had before. Others came with the thought of returning, but never did so. Some returned only to discover that they themselves had changed during the years in America and were no longer content with the life and mores of their villages. The magnitudes of these movements are hard to establish, for the official statistics are more suggestive than definitive, giving the massive illegal movements in both directions. It is known that more than 1 million Mexicans returned to Mexico during the period from 1910 to 1928. This was more than the total legal immigration from Mexico during the first 3 decades of the century. The term wetback was widely used to describe Mexican immigrants, for many simply waded across the Rio Grande River into the United States. Many border towns had large existing Mexican populations, and newcomers could easily blend in and be safe from the authorities. Like other groups of transients, non-English-speaking agricultural laborers, Mexican Americans were often recruited by labor contractors and worked in gangs under the contractors' direction and almost total control. Problems of language, culture, and racial differences were solved by the expedient of contracts between an American employer and a Mexican or Mexican-American labor contractor, who assumed responsibility for collecting and supervising a Mexican workforce and providing them with their food and other requirements. As in the case of the Italian padrone, The Mexican coyote protected his investment in his work crew by all means necessary, including the threat or use of force. In the early period, Mexican-American work crews were even marched through the streets of San Antonio under armed guards. The functions of the coyote included recruiting workers in Mexico, smuggling them into the United States, providing them with forged documents, transportation, and food, and acting as the intermediary between them and the contracting employer. The size of the work crews varied. Once an entire trainload of Mexican-American workers was shipped from Texas to Seattle. Laws against labor contracting were widely evaded. As in the case of the Italian padrone, the coyote faded away only after the people themselves acquired enough knowledge of the language and the country to no longer require his services. Mexicans living in the United States were poor and lived under primitive conditions that were shocking to other Americans. The shanties lacked not only amenities, but also many things that Americans took for granted as necessities: running water and indoor toilets, electricity and stoves. These living conditions, as well as hard working conditions, were less shocking compared to conditions that the Mexicans had known in Mexico. The massive influx clearly revealed their preferences. The Mexicans themselves were viewed with repugnance by Americans in the Southwest, especially Texas. Their poverty, illiteracy, folk culture, race, and work patterns set them apart. Laws reinforced their isolation. Segregated facilities were mandated by law in some parts of the Southwest, notably Texas, and maintained by custom elsewhere. The Mexican immigrants were also viewed with repugnance by many Mexican Americans descended from families that had been in the United States longer, especially when those families were more acculturated, had higher incomes, and were lighter in their skin color. Such people often called themselves Spanish or Latin to avoid being confused with the Mexican immigrants. They regarded the immigrants in much the same way as other middle-class people in other ethnic groups have regarded less acculturated newcomers, as dirty, ignorant, and lacking standards of appropriate behavior. Partly, this reflected the familiar fear that the newcomers would undermine the acceptance of the whole ethnic group by the larger society. Partly also, it reflected the rigid class system in Mexico itself. The more light-complexioned, acculturated, and middle-class portion of the existing Mexican-American population was readily accepted into the white society in many parts of the Southwest, although most of these Mexican-Americans were of mixed Spanish and Indian ancestry, rather than white in the Anglo-Saxon sense. But the newcomers from Mexico were socially shunned by both the native whites and the more Americanized Hispanics. In this early period, more than 90% of all marriages among Mexican Americans were with other Mexican Americans. Yet those do not reflect solidarity among Mexican Americans so much as social exclusion by others. The Mexican American community was destined to remain internally fragmented for many more generations, with few leaders with any substantial recognition, much less following. The early Mexican-American immigrants had very large families, even by the standards of the times in the United States. In 1910, there were 5.3 children born for every Mexican-American woman in her mid-30s to mid-40s. This was substantially above the 3.4 children per woman of the same age among Americans in general at that time. However, Mexican-American families were not unique in high fertility. There were even more children per woman among Polish Americans, 5.9, or Italian Americans, 5.5, and the same number among Jewish Americans, 5.3. These were all groups relatively recently arrived in America as of 1910. What was to be different about Mexican Americans was that their fertility rates did not decline with the years nearly so much as did the fertility rates of all these other groups. By 1969, the fertility rates of all these other groups had been more than cut in half, leaving Mexican Americans the most fertile of the American ethnic groups, with 4.4 children per woman in the 35 to 44 age bracket. Continuing high fertility rates were but one index of the slow acculturation of Mexican immigrants in the United States. High persistence of a foreign language as a native tongue was another. Low rates of application for citizenship was another indication of a very slow acculturation. Such patterns had been common among other ethnic groups with large return migrations, with continuing influxes of newcomers to keep their foreign culture alive, and with highly tentative or ambivalent plans as to permanent residence. But the drastic restrictions of the 1924 immigration laws cut off the new flow of immigrants from most European countries and made a large back-and-forth migration less sustainable, leading to the Americanization of the existing immigrant population. No such drastic restrictions applied to or were enforceable with Mexican immigrants, who continued the pattern of only partial or ambivalent acculturation in America, and large return migrations to Mexico. They were not unique in 1910, but they remained in that pattern long after it had disappeared among other groups. The first wave of immigrants from Mexico in the first 3 decades of the 20th century came to an abrupt halt with the Great Depression of the 1930s. Massive unemployment in America reduced the attraction, and Americans' desire to be rid of Mexican immigrants led to large-scale deportations. Mexicans had long been overrepresented on the relief rolls, partly because an agricultural depression in the 1920s preceded the Great Depression of the 1930s, and Mexican immigrants were disproportionately agricultural. In 1925, for example, 90% of the welfare budget in Riverside, California, was spent on Mexicans. In this and other California cities, many Mexican farm workers regularly went on relief after the growing season ended. High rates of crime and disease among the Mexicans added to the public antipathy toward them. An influx of poverty-stricken Americans from the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma increased the desire to be rid of foreign labor while so many Americans were unemployed. A systematic campaign to deport Mexicans got underway in the early 1930s after it was discovered that the cost of shipping them to Mexico was less than the cost of supporting them for 1 week on relief. Mexicans who applied for relief were likely to be referred to an agency that would send them to Mexico instead. Sometimes relief payments were withheld unless the Mexican recipient agreed, voluntarily, to leave the United States. By one means or another, tens of thousands of Mexican Americans were deported without formal hearings. The massive deportation included many who were American citizens. By 1930, there were more second-generation Mexican Americans in the United States than there were Mexican Americans born in Mexico. The large illegal emigration from Mexico had led to thousands of deportations per year throughout the 1920s. Between 4,000 and 5,000 Mexicans were expelled from the United States in 1927 for having entered illegally. This rose by another 1,000 in 1928 and then went over 8,000 in 1929. This more than doubled in 1930 when more than 18,000 were deported. Nearly 16,000 were deported in 1933, and throughout the later 1930s, about 9,000 Mexicans per year were sent to Mexico. The Mexican population of the United States declined from more than 600,000 in 1930 to less than 400,000 in 1940. Some of the Mexicans were sent back home, but many others, especially the young, were going to a country they had never seen before. Even those who had come from Mexico had often become partially Americanized in their outlook. They were no longer satisfied with the way of life in Mexico, nor were the indigenous Mexicans satisfied with them. Some of the repatriated Mexicans were called gringos in their native villages. The second wave of immigrants. After World War II absorbed millions of Americans into the military services, labor shortages on the farm led to a federal program to bring in farm workers from Mexico. Contract laborers were brought in under the Bracero program, initiated in 1942. The rationale for the program was that there were simply not enough Americans available during the wartime emergency. The influx of Mexicans kept wages from rising sufficiently to attract enough Americans so that every year this emergency program was extended until long after World War II. From about 50,000 in 1945, the number of Mexican contract laborers rose to a peak of over 400,000 a year in the late 1950s. The program was formally ended in 1964. The wartime economy drew workers not only from Mexico. War industries also attracted Mexican Americans away from their traditional jobs and communities into the larger industrial economy and society. There were already more urban than rural Mexican Americans before the war, but jobs in war industries accelerated the urbanization of Mexican Americans. More than half the Mexican American adult males in villages in New Mexico left their villages during World War II. Employment barriers against Mexicans were relaxed during the labor shortages of World War II, as they were for other minorities. Many Mexican Americans served in the military services, and 17 earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. For many Mexican Americans, the military was their first experience in daily living in the mainstream American culture, and this accelerated their acculturation. The GI Bill later allowed Mexican American veterans to attend colleges that might otherwise have been unattainable. In Los Angeles, Mexican American youth gang members often clashed with military servicemen, some of whom dated girls in their neighborhoods. The gang members wore zoot suits, a highly exaggerated outfit of the times, and called themselves pachucos. Gang attacks on soldiers and sailors during wartime brought widespread condemnation on the young zoot suiters, including condemnation from the older generation of Mexican Americans. These gang attacks also brought retaliation by groups of soldiers and sailors in 1942 when they beat up any zoot suiters they encountered on the streets. Decades later, the pachucos would be celebrated in retrospect as heroic militants. Mexican immigration to the United States was less than 2,000 in 1940, but was more than 6,000 by 1944 and was nearly 10,000 by 1952. From there on, the rise was even sharper. In 1956, more than 65,000 Mexican immigrants entered the United States, almost one-fourth of all immigrants from the rest of the world. Not all of these were brought in by the Braquero program. There were many forms of admission on a temporary or a permanent basis, as well as great amounts of illegal entry from Mexico. The second wave of immigration subsided, like the first, in mass deportations. The number expelled reached new heights in the post-war world. The expulsions in 1947 were about 10 times the once record-breaking expulsions of 18,000 in 1930. And this was only the beginning of the Great Expulsions. In 1951, 500,000 Mexicans were expelled, and in 1954, more than 1 million were expelled. Altogether, nearly 4 million people were sent back to Mexico in the post-war era. This time, citizenship was used instead of indigence as the basis for determining who would and who would not be expelled. The third wave of immigration. Immigration from Mexico dropped in the wake of the great deportation drives of the 1950s, but it was not cut off as drastically as in the 1930s. A post-war peak of 65,000 Mexican immigrants in 1956 fell to about 23,000 in 1959 before slowly beginning to rise again. By 1970, the old peak was surpassed. Altogether, about 440,000 people emigrated legally from Mexico during the 1960s. This third wave of immigration, which is still continuing, is based partly on explicit changes in immigration laws, partly on the growth of American legal and social agencies ready to protect and defend illegal aliens, and partly on political fears of offending the Mexican government or Mexican Americans by effective enforcement of existing restrictions on the border. With the demise of the Braquero program in 1964, the Mexican government ceased such efforts as it had made to control illegal border crossings into the United States. Before that, it had tried to protect the legally authorized Mexican contract laborers in the United States from the competition of the wetbacks. There were now hundreds of thousands of former braqueros in Mexico, as well as a rapidly growing Mexican population in general that had tripled in less than 50 years. Cities and towns near the border with the United States had grown especially rapidly. There was a giant pool of potential illegal immigrants to the United States, where the pay remained several times as high as in Mexico. American officials have devised various ways of attempting to relieve pressures on the border without allowing unrestricted immigration. A joint project of the Mexican and American governments has attempted to economically develop the border zone on the Mexican side. This, however, has attracted a larger population influx, of whom about 500,000 are unemployed and therefore potential border crossers. commuters and shoppers from Mexico are allowed ready access to American border communities, from which many then move secretly into the interior to become illegal residents. Some pregnant Mexican women even come in on shopping trips and have their babies in American hospitals, often at public expense, and the children are then American citizens, able to facilitate the future legal emigration of family members from Mexico. In addition to various evasions of immigration restrictions, there is massive outright illegal border crossing along the 2,000-mile boundary, only part of which is effectively covered by a small border patrol. More than 100,000 illegal immigrants are estimated to settle permanently in the United States from Mexico each year, despite the fact that several 100,000 a year are caught and turned back to Mexico. A number of factors prevent the United States from controlling emigration from Mexico as it does from the rest of the world. The long border and huge differences in income between the two countries are fundamental. Massive deportations have substituted for effective border control. The deportations have been made more difficult in recent years by the rise of American social agencies and civil rights organizations, often financed with government money, that challenge the investigations, raids, and arrests that lead to deportation proceedings. Even when these organizations lose the cases, they raise the cost of deportation and therefore limit how many can be deported by the government with given resources. American employers of illegal Mexican aliens have both facilitated their evasions of the law and fought politically against effective border control or against any penalties against themselves for knowingly concealing illegal aliens. Illegal border crossers from Mexico typically face nothing more serious than being sent back. The same person may try many times with little risk, and some have been caught by the Border Patrol more than once in the same night. The policies of the Mexican government have also influenced immigration. Successive Mexican governments have put few, if any, restrictions on the movement of people from Mexico into the southwestern United States, which has sometimes been considered as rightfully part of their ancestral homeland. More practically, Mexican officials have seen the United States as a source of free training in job skills and more hygienic living patterns, which many of the immigrants have brought back as benefits to Mexico. However, post-revolutionary governments in Mexico have also been committed to the principle of repatriating Mexicans from abroad and have even subsidized this repatriation in various ways. Although aware that many seasonal Mexican workers in the United States used these subsidies to get a free trip home during the off-season. With the passing years, the repatriation program has become more selective. The Cardenas government of the 1930s was concerned not to bring back Mexicans who had become used to living on relief in the United States. Since World War II, the program has encouraged the repatriation of people with industrial skills. Generally, however, the Mexican government has treated the problem of enforcing immigration restrictions as an American problem. Its own concern has been largely limited to protecting Mexicans in the United States. It has joined with Mexican-American groups in the United States to oppose any vigorous, repressive activity by the Border Patrol, although Mexico itself is highly vigorous in its exclusion of illegal immigrants who attempt to cross its own southern border. Social and economic progress. The Mexican-American population is both diverse and fragmented. They are concentrated in the American Southwest, but this is an area larger than France, Germany, Italy, and Great Britain put together. The Los Angeles metropolitan area alone is larger than Belgium. Mexican-American communities are widely scattered in the region in which they are concentrated. Moreover, substantial Mexican-American communities exist as far away as Chicago. The widely separated waves of immigration mean that there are substantial differences among Mexican Americans in the length of time their families have been in the United States, in addition to all the other differences of class, education, and occupation that exist in any very large group. There have also been changes in Mexico itself, which affect the characteristics of the Mexican immigrants arriving in the United States at different times. Urbanization in Mexico has been reflected in the country's occupational structure. As of 1940, about 2/3 of all Mexican workers were in agriculture, livestock, or forestry. but by 1970 that proportion had fallen to less than half. Mexican Americans in the United States have likewise become urbanized. In 1950, 68% of Hispanics in the Southwest were urban. By 1960, that proportion had grown to 79%, and by 1970 to 85%. Mexican Americans are more urbanized than the American population as a whole. In another sense, however, they are less urbanized. Mexican Americans have become urban more recently, with all that implies in terms of continuing adjustment. Moreover, Mexican Americans are not living in metropolitan areas quite so much as either blacks or whites. Both the economic and the social conditions of Mexican Americans reflect their great internal diversities. Nearly half the high-income Mexican American family heads surveyed in Los Angeles in the mid-1960s had been born there, while most of the low-income Mexican American family heads had been born outside of California, including 31% who had been born in Mexico. Less than 10% of the high-income Mexican American family heads had been born in Mexico. Another important difference is in location. In 1959, Mexican Americans in California earned more than twice as much as Mexican Americans in Texas. Social class also makes a great difference in personal associations. Half the high-income Mexican Americans in Los Angeles live in areas that are predominantly white American, and half the Mexican American brides in high-status neighborhoods marry outside the Mexican American group, even though about 3/4 of all marriages among Mexican Americans in general are with other Mexican Americans. Generations also differ greatly. The average age of first-generation Mexican Americans is 43. The second generation averages 24 years old, and the third generation is 13. Internal divisions extend to the very name that Mexican Americans choose to call themselves, whether Mexican, Latin, Spanish, Chicano, or others. Names that are cherished by some segments are considered offensive by others. Genteel designations like Spanish or Latin that have long been used to disassociate higher classes from the masses of Mexicans are resented by many. Designations like Chicano are resented by others as exalting a boorish pattern of behavior. The degree of the sensitivities involved may be indicated by the fact that Mexican American political groups have even refused to merge because they could not agree on what name would designate the group. Economic conditions. The outdoor manual labor of early Mexican immigrants, as farm or railroad workers, has for most given way to urban occupations. By 1960, only 16% of Mexican American males in the Southwest were farm laborers, the same as the proportion who were craftsmen, and less than the 23% who were listed as operatives. Only about 5% were clerical workers, and 4% were in the professions, less than among either blacks or whites. Unemployment among Mexican Americans was nearly twice the national average. The average income of Mexican American families was about 65% of that of white, non-Hispanic families in the Southwest. These data conceal many important internal differences. Mexicans earned about 59% of the income of non-Hispanic whites in San Antonio and 84% in San Diego. Mexicans in metropolitan Detroit earned more than double the income of Mexicans in the metropolitan area of Laredo or Brownsville. Sometimes these differences reflect economic differences in the respective communities. The two largest Mexican American urban populations, in Los Angeles and San Antonio, are in cities with very different economic histories and different occupational and income structures for its citizens in general. Mexican Americans located in cities far from the Southwest tend to be people who left the migrant labor stream, and may therefore be a selective group of people, and may have higher earnings for this reason rather than because of location as such. Over the years, Mexican American incomes have risen, not only absolutely, but also relative to the rising incomes in American society in general. In 1949, the personal incomes of Mexican Americans was 57% of that of non-Hispanic whites in the Southwest. By 1959, this had risen to 62%. In 1969, Mexican American males between 25 and 64 years of age earned 66% of the incomes of non-Hispanic whites of the same age in the Southwest. By 1971, they earned 73% of the U.S. average. Meaningful income comparisons are difficult because Mexican Americans are a decade younger than other Americans and have lower levels of schooling in both quantitative and qualitative terms, among other differences. In 1971, Mexican American males aged 25 and up had higher incomes than the U.S. average at all educational levels up to 8 years, and 90% of the U.S. average for those who had attended high school and graduated from high school. These pre-college brackets include the great bulk, over 90%, of Mexican Americans. Their incomes are very close to the incomes of other Americans of the same educational level, but the still large intergroup disparities reflect large disparities in years of schooling. In 1950, Mexican Americans in the Southwest completed only 5 years of school, compared to 11 for the non-Hispanic white population and 8 for blacks in the same region. By 1960, this had risen to 7 years for Mexican Americans compared to 12 for non-Hispanic whites and 9 for blacks. Mexican American education was growing faster than that of either blacks or whites, but remained the lowest among the three groups. Quality performances are also different, and to the disadvantage of Mexican Americans. Mexican American youngsters scored lower on IQ and other standardized tests, whether in separate schools or in mixed schools, and whether the parents were laborers, white-collar workers, or skilled workers. Double standards of grading Mexican children partly conceal these differences, in part for the emotional well-being of the student, and in part not to rock the educational boat. However, the accumulated educational deficiencies affect what kinds of colleges or courses of study in college can be pursued by those few Mexican American young people who get there. Most Mexican Americans who have gone to college have attended the lower-ranked colleges. In Texas, for example, there were less than 1/3 as many Mexican Americans enrolled in the top state university at Austin than at lower-ranked El Paso, even though the number of students in general at Austin is much larger. Against this background, it is not surprising that Mexican American men who have attended colleges earned only 77% of the U.S. average for all men who have attended college, whereas Mexican American men hold their own very well against other men with similar educational backgrounds at the lower educational levels, where the quality of the schooling itself often has little effect on job performance. The earnings of Hispanics in general show a higher rate of return to a given quality of schooling than among either blacks or whites. That is, economically, Hispanics make the most of what they have educationally, but they have less to begin with. Other factors also complicate income comparisons. Labor force participation rates among Mexican American females is much lower than among either black or white women, which affects both personal and family income statistics. Unemployment among Mexican American men is about double that among black men and 3 times that among white men. A family's economic standard of living depends not only on its income, but also on how many people must be supported by it. Mexican Americans have far lower per capita income than would be indicated by their individual or family earnings. For example, Mexican American per capita income was only 47% that of non-Hispanic whites in the Southwest in 1959 and was lower than the per capita income of blacks. This may partly explain why Mexican Americans, with higher incomes than blacks, nevertheless live in crowded housing more often and send their children to college less often. The Mexicans simply have more mouths to feed. The large number of children per family among Mexican Americans may also help explain why the women are in the labor force less often than either black or white women. The proportion of people too old or too young to work is higher among Mexican Americans than among either blacks or whites. This is due to larger numbers of children because there are smaller proportions of older Mexican Americans than among either blacks or whites. The economic progress of Mexican Americans affects different generations differently See the table below. So we'll go to that table now. First-generation Mexican-American men born in Mexico earn significantly less than either the second or third-generation Mexican-American men, but the second generation earns about 14% higher average income than the third generation. This might seem to suggest that progress stops and retrogression sets in after the second generation. This is not true, however. The three generations differ substantially in age distribution, the first generation being the oldest, the second generation next, and the third generation the youngest. When age is taken into account, the first generation is at an even greater disadvantage than first appeared to be the case. For example, the third generation's mean income is about 11% higher than that of the first generation, but in all the prime earning years, from 25 to 64, the third generation makes about 20% more than the first generation Mexican Americans of the same age. The paradox of apparently higher earnings in the second than in the third generation is due to age differences. More than half of the second generation is over 35 years of age, while most of the third generation is under 35. Bracket for bracket, the second and third generations earn virtually the same incomes. This does not mean that progress has halted. Both the second and the third generations share in the absolute rise of Mexican American incomes and in its rise relative to that of other Americans. The first generation also progresses. Those who remain in the United States for 15 years or more eventually overtake native-born Mexican Americans in income. After a decade, Mexican immigrants have incomes only 5% below those of native-born Mexican Americans, and after 2 decades, the immigrants surpass the native-born by 3%. The long time required for immigrants from Mexico to equal native-born Mexican Americans in income suggests the importance of what economists call human capital, both specific skills and general experience in a given economy. It includes making contacts, learning to use existing institutions, knowing how to find better jobs, and how to get promoted. These internal patterns raise serious questions about common assertions that Mexican Americans' income differences from general population are largely or solely caused by employer discrimination. As noted already, Mexican American men have incomes about as high as or higher than other American men with similar educational qualifications through the high school level. A factor whose effect is difficult to gauge is that substantial numbers of Mexicans in the United States are illegal aliens. Many employers prefer them, for they are in no position to cause the employer trouble and may accept lower pay or poorer working conditions because they cannot usually invoke legal remedies without fear of exposing their illegal status or having their employer do so in retaliation. During the Braquero era, for example, legal migrants had numerous government protections as to their pay and treatment, but wetbacks did not. Many employers preferred wetbacks to braqueros. With the extension of the minimum wage law to agricultural workers in 1966, native Mexican Americans and Mexicans working in the United States with legal authorization had their costs to an employer raised further above those of illegal aliens. Social conditions. The family is central in Mexican American culture. Warmth inside the family and hostility to those outside the family has characterized the Mexican family as it characterized the Italian immigrant family. Close friends complete a tight circle of social activity and relationships. Machismo concepts give the family a male-dominated flavor, makes protection of the women's chastity a preoccupation, and inhibits their employment. About half of all Mexican-American married women were married in their teens. This contributes to their even lower college attendance than Mexican men, although the sexes are evenly represented through high school, and to the very large families characteristic of Mexicans in either Mexico or the United States. Family breakups are much less common among Mexican Americans than among other low-income groups. The rate of divorce among Mexican American women is lower than among whites and less than half the rate among blacks or Puerto Ricans. Only 12% of Mexican American families are female-headed, compared to 31% among blacks and 34% among Puerto Ricans. Mexican Americans average larger families than either black or white Americans, Puerto Ricans, or any other ethnic group. In 1960, more than 2/3 of all Mexican American children were born to mothers who had 5 or more children. The diversity of Mexican Americans, however, is indicated by the fact that while low-income women with less than a high school education averaged more than 6 children each, middle-class Mexican American women who had completed high school averaged just 2. In short, family size reflects the degree of acculturation to American norms. This is also shown historically, for Mexican American families in the past, while even larger than today, were no larger than the families of a number of other contemporary ethnic groups. But after the severe immigration restrictions of 1924 led these other groups to become more Americanized, their fertility declined much faster than that of Mexican Americans, who continued to have their Mexican culture reinforced by continued massive inflows of people from Mexico. Geographic differences drive home the same point. Heavy concentrations of Mexicans, enough to perpetuate a culture, have typically meant higher fertility rates than in places where the Mexican population is more scattered or is a smaller part of the general population. Metropolitan areas of Texas communities like Brownsville and Laredo, with heavy concentrations of Mexicans going back for many generations, and with a strong separate subculture, average much higher fertility rates than newer and less concentrated Mexican populations in Los Angeles or Long Beach. Although Los Angeles has the largest Mexican American population of any city, Mexican Americans are a smaller percentage of the total population than in Laredo or Brownsville or various other Texas cities. Even within Los Angeles, Mexicans in the East Los Angeles barrio have a higher fertility rate than those in the city as a whole. Mexican women in their mid-30s to mid-40s in the Brownsville area have had more than 5 children, while Mexican women of the same age in Long Beach have had less than 3. About half the Mexican women in Long Beach have completed high school, compared to about 1/6 in Brownsville and less than 10% in Lubbock, Texas, where Mexican women in the same age bracket average 5.5 children. Spanish is the language that is spoken in nearly half the Mexican American homes. Nationally, about 47% of Mexican Americans grew up in homes where Spanish was the language spoken, a high persistence of a foreign language compared to that of various European ethnic groups, but not compared to the proportion among Puerto Ricans, 72%, or Cubans, 87%. Language use, like other aspects of acculturation, varies greatly among Mexican Americans, from place to place and from class to class. Half of the higher income Mexican Americans living in predominantly non-Mexican neighborhoods in Los Angeles speak English mostly or solely to their children, and another 40% speak both Spanish and English to them. But among lower income Mexican Americans in the Los Angeles barrios, half of them speak Spanish solely or predominantly, and another 24% speak both. In San Antonio, almost 3/4 of the low-income Mexican-American parents in the barrios there speak Spanish predominantly or exclusively to their children, and even higher-income, middle-income parents usually do not emphasize English. About half the Mexican-Americans in both cities consider themselves bilingual. The language spoken has both educational and economic impact. Hispanics whose mother tongue was English had completed high school about 50% more often than those whose mother tongue was Spanish, and had gone on to college about 70% more often. Almost half of all low-income Mexican Americans in Los Angeles report difficulty in speaking English. The percentage is even higher in San Antonio. The proportion of higher-income Mexican Americans who had difficulty with English is much lower in both cities. Language choice and proficiency have in recent years become ideological issues rather than simply pragmatic questions related to functioning in an English-speaking country. Attempts to teach English in school and to get Hispanic youngsters to use English more are seen by some, including non-Hispanic intellectuals, as an attempt to stigmatize Spanish as inferior. Even tragic situations growing out of an inability to communicate, with paramedics, firemen, or policemen, for example, have only led some to demand that all those in these occupations learn to speak Spanish. At one time, public schools in the Southwest discouraged, forbade, and even punished the use of Spanish by Mexican American students in order to get them to learn English. In more recent times, under political and federal court pressure, schools have instituted bilingual programs, often taught almost exclusively in Spanish. It remains to be seen what effect this will have on general acculturation or economic progress. The Spanish spoken by Mexican Americans is not classic Castilian Spanish, but a folk dialect reflecting the language of the poorer people of Mexico, together with modifications of American words in the manner of the early Italian immigrants. In order to get a purer Spanish, American television stations in the Spanish language usually import announcers from Latin America, although Mexican American performers may be used for other purposes. Spanish language television and radio stations in the United States are preferred mainly by the poorer, less acculturated Mexican Americans, but English language newspapers are preferred to Spanish language newspapers by Mexican Americans at various income levels and regardless of neighborhoods. The goals and values of Mexican Americans have never centered on education. As of 1960, only 13% of Hispanics in the Southwest completed high school, compared to 17% for blacks in the same region, 28% among non-Hispanic whites, and 39% among Japanese Americans. However, this too shows changes with time. As of 1950, only 8% of Southwestern Hispanics had completed high school. In one decade, this rose to 13% and then to 29% in 1970. Education has varied greatly among Mexicans with different exposures to American norms. Among third-generation Mexican Americans in these areas, 38% completed high school, but among those in the urban first generation, Mexican-born, only 13% had done so, and among the rural first generation, only 4% had completed high school. Various attempts have been made to determine Mexican American cultural values by questionnaires rather than by actual behavior. But answering a questionnaire costs nothing and therefore cannot test the depth of a commitment, particularly to a process like education that takes many years and that many find distasteful. Among Mexican Americans, as among other ethnic groups, acculturation is not a simple one-way process. The larger society in the Southwest has adopted many Mexican features, not only such practical things as Mexican ranching equipment and practices, but such other cultural features as Mexican food and Spanish names. Many of the names of places in the Southwest have historically been preserved since Spanish times, but many other Spanish names of places and streets are quite recent, and were provided by non-Hispanics for other non-Hispanics. Marina del Rey, for example, is a relatively new community with very few Hispanic residents. There are also many new Spanish-named streets with few, if any, Hispanic residents, such as Avenida de Cortez in Pacific Palisades, as only one example. The social pathology of Mexican Americans reflects their age composition. Mexican Americans have lower than average mortality from degenerative diseases that come with age, cancer, chronic heart disease, and vascular lesions, but high mortality rates from rheumatic heart disease, pneumonia, and automobile accidents. Fatal automobile accidents are a leading cause of death among Mexican American young men, accounting for 43% of all deaths in the 16 to 25-year-old bracket. Infant mortality is also very high. Crime and violence take a heavy toll among Mexican Americans in general, and urban youth gangs in particular. An estimated 13,000 Mexican American youths belong to gangs in Los Angeles County alone, where there were 69 killings in 1977. Politics. For many years, Mexican Americans were both socially and politically invisible, working and living in isolated rural communities or in the separate world of urban barrios. Mexican Americans had little impact on the political system or on the life of the larger community. Because so few became naturalized citizens, and those who did seldom voted, political leaders paid little attention to them. In a pattern coming over from Mexico, many Mexican Americans have tried to have as little as possible to do with the government. The fact that many were illegal aliens reinforced this tendency. The post-World War II era saw this long-standing pattern begin to change. Mexican American men serving in the armed forces saw a wider vision of the world and returned home after the war with broader aspirations and more assertiveness. The larger society's growing awareness of the problems and rights of minorities provided a setting in which political awareness could develop and express itself. By the 1960s, the civil rights movement and protest organizations of blacks and other ethnic groups provided a model and an impetus for similar developments among Mexican Americans. Perhaps the best known of these political movements grew out of Cesar Chavez's labor union among agricultural workers, which emerged in the 1960s. Whatever the economic consequences of Chavez's union efforts, thousands of jobs have been eliminated by mechanization in the wake of union pay increases. He has become a nationally known figure whose political support therefore carries weight. Mexican Americans achieved elective office late and in small numbers, but beginning in the 1950s, a number of Mexican Americans achieved high national office. Joseph Montoya became a congressman from New Mexico in 1957 and a U.S. senator in 1964 after a long career in state politics. Henry B. Gonzalez became a congressman from Texas in 1961, and then Edward R. Roybal was elected to Congress from California in 1962. Elio de la Garza from Texas in 1964, and Manuel Lujan from New Mexico in 1968. In 1974, Mexican Americans were elected governors in 2 states, Raul Hector Lopez becoming governor of Arizona and Jerry Apodaca governor of New Mexico. At the state level, there were, by 1967, just over 600 state legislators of Mexican ancestry in the Southwest. In addition, many Mexican American spokesmen emerged at the national or local level to lead organizations of various sizes and durability. Some of these were patterned after black protest movements, the Brown Berets after the Black Panthers, for example. However, most Mexican Americans have literally never heard of these various organizations, however seriously the media treat their assertions in the name of Chicanos. Despite individual political achievements, Mexican Americans as a group are still not strong participants in politics. Rates of naturalization, registration, and voting are all low among Mexican Americans. Moreover, political unity has been difficult to achieve among people from such a highly individualistic culture. One example of the difficulty of translating large numbers of Mexican Americans into voting strength is seen in Los Angeles, which has more Mexicans than most cities in Mexico, but which has not had a Mexican elected to the city council in nearly 20 years. There are fewer Mexican American members of the California legislature than there are black members, although blacks are only half as large a portion of the population. When Mexican Americans do vote, they vote overwhelmingly Democratic. In 1960, for example, John F. Kennedy won 85% of the Mexican American vote. Lyndon Johnson won 90% in 1964, and Hubert Humphrey 87% in 1968. The lack of diversity in their voting makes it unnecessary for one party and futile for the other to exert itself to get the Mexican vote. Mexican Americans today. The diverse elements of the Mexican American population are at very different stages of acculturation and economic advancement. Nevertheless, progress is apparent across broad economic, political, and social areas. Compared to groups that have been here longer, or that arrived with more education and skills, Mexicans have not yet achieved the same economic levels. Compared to other groups emerging from an agricultural past and with no tradition of education, Mexican Americans have more than held their own. As of 1979, Mexican American family income was 18% higher than that of blacks and 54% higher than that of Puerto Ricans. It was 73% of the American national average. Numerous well-known Mexican Americans have emerged in sports and entertainment, the traditional areas of opportunity for emerging ethnic groups. Tennis champion Pancho Gonzalez established an enduring reputation in the 1940s and 50s. Joe Kapp and Jim Plunkett have become National Football League quarterbacks. Lee Trevino and Nancy Lopez are among the top golfers. Mexican-American singers have included Vicky Carr, Joan Baez, and Trini Lopez. Mexican-American actors have a long line going back to Ramon Novarro and Gilbert Roland in the silent screen era, and to Ricardo Montalban and Anthony Quinn in more recent times. Similar achievements have not been made in scholarship, science, or the professions, all of which depend on higher education, which few Mexican Americans reach. As late as 1973, there were only 3 or 4 Mexican Americans with PhDs in economics, 8 with PhDs in political science, and only 24 with PhDs in sociology. Moreover, even among these very few, the tendency in recent years has been to devote themselves to social and political activism rather than to scholarship in their respective professions. In broadly defined professions, ranging from physicians to school teachers, there were more than 90,000 persons of Spanish surname in the Southwest in 1970. This was about the same as the total number of persons of Chinese and Japanese ancestry in the same professions, but there were only about 1/4 as many persons of Chinese and Japanese ancestry in the United States as there were persons of Spanish surname in the Southwest. The proportion of Mexican Americans in the professions is also lower than among blacks. About half of all employed Mexican Americans today are native-born Americans whose parents were also born in the United States. The other half either came from Mexico themselves or their parents were Mexican. This means that the people whose achievements are being repeatedly compared to the national average have been here about 1.5 generations. From the rural Mexican cultures of the 1920s to modern urban America today is a very long journey in human terms. Most Mexican Americans have come a long way on that journey.